Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started, even though a few people may still be trickling in after class. My name is Susan Farbstein. I'm a clinical professor here at the law school and one of the co-directors of the International Human Rights Clinic. On behalf of our program and our co-sponsors, in particular HLS advocates, we're really pleased to welcome everyone here today for this panel. The panel, as you know, kicks off a 2-week exhibit here at the law school of the so-called Caesar photos. As you can see, we have some, and difficult as it might be to believe this, some of the less graphic ones which are stationed around the room. The exhibit will run for 2 weeks in Lewis 202. It's only the third time that these photos have been publicly displayed here in the U.S. following exhibits at UN headquarters and at the U.S. Congress, so we're really pleased and grateful to have been able to bring the photos here to Harvard Law School. So this panel is going to explore the role of photography and of these photos in particular in sort of documenting and raising awareness about the human rights violations that have been taking place in Syria. I think we'll also talk a little bit about sort of accountability options that might be more possible because of having this kind of evidence available. Since we only have an hour, I'm just going to jump into introducing our panelists. Everyone will speak for a few minutes, then I'll ask some questions, and then we hope to have plenty of time for questions from all of you. So sitting to my left is someone who really needs no introduction, Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who was, until earlier this year, the U.S. ambassador at large on war crimes issues. He obviously has extensive experience working on international criminal law, serving as a prosecutor at both the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And while ambassador, he played a key role in thinking about accountability options, whether potential ICC referral, whether some kind of special regional court, whether prosecutions in various national jurisdictions. So we're looking forward to hearing from him. Sitting to his left is Jess Thompson, who's an American attorney and is the policy director at United for a Free Syria. Prior to joining them, Tyler served as legal counsel at the Public International Law and Policy Group. He directed their ceasefire practice area. He's also served as a legal and strategic advisor to the Syrian coalition at the Geneva II Peace Conference. He's advised components of the Syrian opposition since 2011, and he's been a member of the Cesars support team since 2014. Seated to his left is Mouaz Moustafa, who's the executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, which is an organization that seeks to support freedom and democracy in Syria, that tries to convey the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people to the American public. And that also supports humanitarian efforts in Syria. Mouaz was born and raised in Damascus and moved to the U.S. as a teenager. And he previously spent more than 4 years working in Congress, and he's also done work with the Egyptian opposition and the Libyan opposition. And seated to his left is Naomi Kikoler, who's the deputy director of the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her work focuses on mass atrocity prevention and on international human rights law and advocacy. Prior to her time at the Holocaust Museum, she worked for Amnesty International. She also worked at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, looking at populations at risk and how to implement R2P. So we're really thrilled to have sort of such a diversity of perspectives and engagement with Syria represented on the panel. With that, I'm just going to turn it over to Ambassador Rapp.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Susan, and I'll try to be brief and leave time for questions. Susan mentioned that I'd worked as a prosecutor in the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and very much in part of the International Justice Project, and helped the United States engage in a supportive way to the International Criminal Court. And over the post-Cold War period, it's been possible to convict a prime minister for genocide, Kambanda for Rwanda. It's been possible to bring Milosevic to trial in The Hague. Tragically died just before his trial was completed. And then in the case that I was directly involved, to prosecute a president, Charles Taylor, and eventually convict him of 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And of course, during the course of this administration, and I served as ambassador at large for war crimes issues for 6 years, halfway through that we renamed it as global criminal justice, recognizing that we want justice globally, and consistent with the ICC principle, we want it as close to the home as it can be. If you can do it at the national level, that's what's called complementarity in the ICC world. The international court's only complementary to the national institution. You want to do it there. If you have problems with capacity, you work to supply that capacity. If you have problems with independence, then you try to develop perhaps a mixed court or a hybrid court. And it's only when there's no possibility of doing that you go to the international level. And clearly we've got now 8 cases in the ICC, and we strongly support, the U.S. government, when I was there, strongly supported all of them. But when people look at those cases, they say, well, why is the ICC dealing with those? I mean, post-election violence in Kenya was horrendous, 1,300 people killed, 600,000 displaced, but look at Syria, 250,000 dead so far, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. That 250,000 line, according to them, was just crossed about a week ago. And no response. And of course, Syria is not in the ICC, unlike Kenya, but we had the Libya case, where within 15 days of the beginning of that conflict, and with Gaddafi threatening to chase people down, Zenga to Zenga, room to room, closet to closet, and kill them like rats or cockroaches, the international community responded 15-0 with a referral to the ICC. That, of course, hasn't been possible in Syria because of the Russian and Chinese opposition to it. It was finally put to a vote in May of 2014. We lobbied hard to get as many of the non-aligned countries on board, and in the end we had 13 of the 15 members of the Security Council that voted yes, 2 who voted no, but of course those were veto-wielding members. So trying to establish accountability, trying to do for the victims in the situation in Syria what has been done elsewhere has been an enormous challenge, and it's in the face of massive violations. And of course we see those of torture, of people being tortured to death, and indeed the numbering system here, and I've met with Cesar several times, hosted him in my home. I know him well. We've also had these photos analyzed, the metadata by the FBI, and they've determined no artifacts, no computer generation of images, that these depict real people and real events. But this kind of horrendous torture, and this is only part of it. This is the bodies that came through one military hospital in Damascus from the facilities in that area, and their facilities in other areas. And this is during a period of about 2 years, and that was 2 years ago. And every indication we have is that this kind of thing continues, and there are 100,000 people in these facilities that continue to be subjected to this kind of treatment. And other things that are being committed. I mean, doctors and nurses and medical facilities being targeted. I mean, every sort of rule that we thought applied to war, and that is applied even to some non-international armed conflicts, has been observed, including famously the use of poison gas, killing 1,300 men, women, and children in Ghouta in 2013. These rules are being violated, and what's the response of the international community? And it's not sufficient. It certainly wasn't sufficient for me. It's not sufficient for the people of Syria to say, well, we'll wait until it's over. We'll wait, and frankly, sometimes it's hard to succeed until it's over. But in other situations, we've been able to grapple with it beforehand. And the approach that we've taken, just to be clear, is one is to support every sort of investigative effort that we can to build the evidence so that it will be there when the day for accountability arrives, when there are courts with jurisdiction. But I'll mention the fact that there are some today. Of course, this includes support of the International Commission of Inquiry. I saw my good friend Sarita Ashraf, who's here this term and has been working with the Commission. They've now reported an unprecedented 10 times. I mean, they mandated 8 times. I don't think there's ever been one of these commissions of inquiries that's had more than 2 mandates, but because of the ongoing crisis, and they're reporting in each of their reports on all of the war crimes. And of course, as we know, even though I would note that 90% of the deaths are at the hands of the regime destruction everything, and focusing on the sort of moderate opposition and its attacks has led to the rise of ISIS and other extremist groups, and they're committing horrible acts as well. So any kind of justice would have to deal with those cases as well. So we've got the Human Rights Council's created commission. We also are supporting documentation efforts, and it was one of our initiatives announced by Hillary Clinton in April of 2012 to establish a Syrian Justice and Accountability Center to fund Syrian-based and mixed sort of efforts to document evidence. And some of these, one in particular, has brought out more than 600,000 pages of documents in Syria and is developing sort of dossier-ready cases and pretrial briefs, actually, everything you need except a court to take them to. But frankly, I think that's a very useful thing to do. And certainly looking particularly at the linkage between the crimes that are committed and high-level actors. But obviously a key part of this also is the kind of documentation that we see here with the Caesar evidence, which, from my experience in dealing with these things and my sort of historical knowledge of them, is probably the most impressive and the strongest evidence I've seen in a war crimes prosecution. I mean, better even than the Nazis. The Nazis had sometimes names of people that were taken into concentration camps. They don't have very many pictures of identifiable victims, and they don't put cards on them that identify the facility they came from and where it was done to them, and where you can know where the who's responsible for that facility from other documentation. And this will give us the ability to prosecute the heads of these various facilities on a command responsibility basis. Obviously, other evidence to prosecute the people that sent it there, and those that were the most active torturers, et cetera, that were really the sort of the real sort of evildoers here, understanding that any kind of justice process in Syria needs to only prosecute the most responsible, the real authors of these crimes, and there can be other forms of transitional justice for the rest. But finally, just in terms of what's possible now, there are some cases of these individuals coming from third states, and so that would give the country where they came from the ability to prosecute the responsible people in Syria under a passive personality basis. If you've taken those courses, you know what that means. But of course, you won't have that. You won't have the head of 235 sitting in court in France or Germany or someplace else. You'll have maybe a wanted poster, out for that individual. Though, frankly, that's what international courts often do, and by doing that, signal to people to stop, and others may stop or defect because they don't want to be part of that. Also, I think because these are acts of torture, we are talking about a crime of universal jurisdiction. And to the extent that countries have legislated to the maximum on universal jurisdiction, there could be cases even without a citizen victim and even without a perpetrator present. Consistent with that, though there's a challenge with their statute, Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius of France announced at the end of last month that the French were opening an investigation based on the Caesar information of those responsible for these acts. If you look at the French Penal Code, they do have the right to begin an investigation, but they won't be able to prosecute anybody or put out a wanted poster unless they've got somebody actually in France. By contrast, Germany, the country that's taking more Syrian refugees than any other, I mean, talking about 800,000 refugees this year, with the largest part of them being Syria, has universal jurisdiction with discretion in the national prosecutor looking at what the interest of Germany is in the case. And it seems to me with this profound impact of refugees, there is a stronger public policy reason to do it. As you may know, the U.S. government sometimes has been concerned about universal jurisdiction cases in Tibet, about Tibetan cases, Tibetan victims that end up in Spain, because they may be they really don't have an issue. It's more of a political kind of thing. But in this kind of crime and with this kind of impact, I think there's a strong argument for beginning cases. And I personally delivered the Cesar material to prosecutors across Europe and other documentation in the hope that we can finally begin to at least signal that the world can respond to this kind of crime while it's happening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. You know, Syria has become the preeminent conflict in the world. It's become international in nature. You have very powerful countries coming in on all sides of it. And you may be wondering, and as we get asked this question often in Washington by U.S. policymakers, yes, these photos are horrible. What the Assad regime has done to these people in its prisons is horrible. But let's be realistic here about how we're going to get to a resolution to this conflict. Let's make some concessions about the Assad government and about the role that they have to play in a transition, despite the fact that they have committed these atrocities. And many of you may be aware of the concept of or the tension between peace and justice in conflict resolution theory. And in that, some people argue that an overzealous focus on justice and accountability can somehow complicate the quest for peace. And this argument, of course, is based in the fact that in order to resolve conflict, parties need to feel that their interests are being met, or they need to be shown that the costs of the hostilities are no longer justifiable in pursuit of their interests. So many argue, or some argue, that the threat of prosecution and harsh accountability for the perpetrators of the crimes like those depicted in these photos can sometimes entrench the parties, and that if there's prosecution efforts against the loser of a conflict, then they would have a lot more to lose than in giving up the fight. And in some conflicts throughout the world, you see a lot of considerations for peace put in front of justice or a balancing act. So you'll have reconciliation efforts, truth-seeking efforts, memorialization for atrocities. But in a conflict like Syria, with such a huge portion of the atrocities being committed by the Assad government and such a huge percentage of the civilians who die in the conflict being killed at the hand of the Assad government, Syria is a case where there can be no peace without justice, and which is, you know, it's a cliche at this point, but in Syria that couldn't be more true. The Caesar file shows a certain type of killing that the Assad government does. Torture, you know, after long periods of detention. But it's certainly not the only atrocity that the Assad government commits. They drop barrel bombs on hospitals, schools, open marketplaces. They also use conventional missiles to strike these places. They use chemical weapons. They kill people through conventional means on the ground. The Caesar file is special, though, because it puts the world in extremely close proximity to the victims by the use of high-definition, up-close photographs. It shows a widespread system that's designed to kill and torture civilians, but also to kill the dream of an entire people, and also to teach a country that the only option is submission. Assad's meticulous documentation of the brutality of the wounds show that the fact that torture is an international crime, that various crimes against humanity are outlawed in the international system, it shows that that is no deterrence to him. And I wish I could say that what you'll see in these photos in the exhibit here at Harvard is the worst of what's in these files, but that's certainly not the case. We selected the 30 or so photos that are here to give a taste of the horrors that are in them, but there are some that are much, much worse. And like I was saying, the fact that these are crimes has not slowed Assad. And for this conflict, and for future conflicts, there can be no peace without justice for these types of crimes. In the international sphere and in U.S. politics, there has been a constant, at times smaller, at times bigger, but constant quest to rehabilitate Assad, the Assad government, in the eyes of the American people, in the eyes of the international community, and to be seen as a viable prospect for peace in the country. They have very strong allies in Iran and Russia and other places. And the United States doesn't really have a strong interest right now in confronting these powerful allies on the battlefield or in the political realm. It seems that we would, in some places, prefer to hand the conflict over to countries like Russia and Iran and let them deal with it, let it be their quagmire. But this effort would undoubtedly lead to the rehabilitation of the Assad government. And these photos we are told, actually, we were told by people inside the U.S. government that they have helped to prevent that backslide from happening faster in the United States. The fact that these photos were shown in Congress, at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, at the UN headquarters, has prevented so-called realists from saying maybe we ought to work with this guy to bring about a resolution to the conflict or fight terrorism. There's just something about these photos. In 2011 to 2013, there was no ISIS. Most of these people had nothing to do with the uprising. They were just driving along and were picked up by security and had no idea why they were thrown in detention. So it needs to be made clear that Assad cannot be rehabilitated. There needs to be justice to resolve this conflict. And American policymakers need to see that this is the case, as do the international community. Our American government has failed us all by providing no consequences. And in fact, Ambassador Rapp is one of the few folks in the U.S. government that has been brave enough, who has had the clarity of ethics, and who understands the nature of conflict to push for justice, strong justice for these crimes. And so I'll just end by saying the fact that this torture is allowed to be continued by the Assad government, the fact that barrel bombs continue to fall, even with Russia inside the country and at times, bombing hospitals themselves, the fact that the whole spectrum of international crimes has been committed in the country and hundreds of thousands of people are dead should just be a testament that for Syria and for the rest of the world, there can be no peace without justice for these crimes. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for giving us this opportunity. I really want to thank Harvard Law School and everybody that put this together and allowed us to put the display on, which will be there for the next 2 weeks. And I think it's a very powerful one. You should encourage you to go and see the rest of these photos and others to go see them as well. And I wanted to just sort of, Syria is so complex, right? And everybody's looking at it, and you've got the Russians and the Iranians and the Saudis and the Qataris and all these different forces, and this is too complicated and so on. And it's true, looking at it from the outside, I wish I could take every single person here, if not to Syria, at least to the border, and come back, because I think 30 minutes there is worth hours and hours of researching and trying to figure out what's going on. But what's always, I think, inspiring for me and for the rest of everyone that's probably doing advocacy on behalf of the Syrian people outside is that for them it's still really simple. For them, they went out calling for their universal rights, for their dignity above many other things, for democracy, for their freedom. they're doing this against a dictator that didn't even cater to Western sensitivities, right? It's not like a Mubarak in Egypt, where maybe it was useful. Someone who supports terrorist organizations, someone who, a destabilizing agent for the world and the region, a bad person and a family that has really held hostage Syria for a long time. And they say that we are here, we're internally displaced refugees because of that, or we are refugees now because of that. And they keep it at that. They don't go into detail. They know. 7-year-olds know, I'm amazed, in some of these internally displaced camps about what was the latest UN hearing, the Security Council, what's going on outside. And they'll say, like, the Arabs are worthless, and the Arab League is worth, and all this stuff. And it's amazing, right? These are children. So they know, but to them, when you ask them that question, it's very simple. So I just want to say quickly, to remind people of what happened for anyone that's not familiar with the whole story, is that in March 2011, children, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, wrote on the wall what they were seeing on TV channels as they saw the Arab Spring sort of come up, which was very inspiring to see thousands of people in Cairo and in Tunisia to see a peaceful transition of government, all of this stuff, and wrote freedom and so on these walls. And the governor of Daraa ordered, and the security apparatus and everybody took these children, tortured them to death. When the parents went to ask for accountability just for those crimes against the kids, no one's calling against the fall of the regime. I didn't even expect anything to happen, Arab Spring-like or revolution in Syria. They were told to go home and make new ones. And the people of Daraa are amazing people, right? These guys are very patriotic. If you look at Daraa, by the way, there's no ISIS. There's no, I think this is a, and not to say that in other places people are more radical, but to say that these are sort of some of it's like the heartland of Syria. And so people came out sort of, asking for justice for their children. And at the time, only asking for reforms of this regime, not the downfall even then. And it was 8-9 months of peaceful protests where bare chests were met with bullets, where people were incarcerated for no reason into these prisons where this was their fate. And that was in 2011, not until 9 months after that, by the dictator's own admission in a speech that there were no violent protesters and so on. Defectors from the army that didn't want to kill their own people came out and so on. I just want to remind people of that just beginning story. By the way, most of the protests that popped up in other places, in Homs and Hama and so on, were doing it to lay off the pressure from Daraa. So come get us and leave these guys alone. And what's shocking for them, and what's shocking for people, if you talk to people and you tell them what really, what bothers you, for them, other than losing their dignity by being in a camp, even if state-of-the-art camps, it's really hard thing to be in a refugee camp and wait on handouts, especially for a proud people and smart, intelligent. They've lived a stable life. This isn't Afghanistan. This isn't, a place where they're used to war. It's the fact that the world has deserted us, they would say. And it's so true. I almost wish that before this whole thing happened, a lot more people visited Syria, because I would think they would do way more now for them, knowing what had happened. And I'll end there, and I'll talk a little bit just quickly about who this person is, the reason that we're able to come here. Caesar. And Caesar is an apolitical guy, not interested in politics, not very highly educated, a military police forensic photographer that worked before the revolution as a forensic photographer. Anything that happened under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense in terms of incidents, deaths, whatever, he would take photos if it was a drowning or a fire or what have you. And in 2011, he was asked to go to a military hospital and take pictures of incidents that had happened within the Ministry of Defense. And when he went, he saw 15 men, women, children, civilians, at least in his eyes or with his understanding, and that were tortured to death. And quickly afterwards, he was shocked by what he saw. Someone that's not political, that's not even involved in a protest or anything like that, went to a relative in his family and said, "Look, I cannot be part of this, and figure out a way for me to get out of the country." And so the relative contacted a team, which essentially is the Caesar team that continues to work now, and the answer was, of course, we'll help you get out, and would you stay? Seeing this opportunity to document what was going on. And it was Caesar's decision And by the way, this is someone that's not looking into transitional justice or accountability, that's not looking into the political implications of showing this to the world. He just thought that it would be good for families to have closure. You know, people that are still bribing officials and sending money to jailers that are promising that they're giving their family water or food or extra blanket at night or whatever, for them to know, you know, to know not to live on this sort of false hope. And for 2.5 years, a simple man, a man that comes from sort of the suburbs and the farmlands of Syria, risked life for 2.5 years, both a danger from the revolutionaries or the government, because he was a military policeman, to sneak out day-by-day flash drives of pictures that he had taken and others had taken as he archived them into the state system on the computers. And we ended up with the almost 55,000 photographs of men, women, and children, Kurds, Druze, Christians, Alawites, people that had Bashar and his dad's face tattooed on them. It shows that this is a regime that is killing across the board. Sometimes I think I wish he was just killing one ethnicity, because then we can say genocide and people could move. But, you know, it's okay. It's not genocide. He's killing everybody, so it's fine. And so, you know, he did this. He's not someone that even wants to be in this position. He doesn't understand even the full thing that he has in his portfolio, but was willing to come to the United States, was willing to sit down. You can see him there in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee wearing, he's terrified, you know, what could happen. He's seen what happens to people, so he could imagine what could happen to some of his own family members or himself. And, you know, wearing the hood and the mask and the glasses and everything, and spoke in front of Congress, saying what he saw, went to the White House, sat down with Samantha Power, talked to the FBI, sent a letter to the president who wasn't willing to meet him, and went back now in a safe place in Europe where he realized that, honestly, no one cared. He actually thought this would outrage people into some sort of action. We did see plenty of outrage, and we'll see it again today. But we'll see zero action, unfortunately. And so I can talk for hours, but I just want to end there, and I just want to, you know, Cesar is just an example of the many Syrians that know, everybody knows what happens in these prisons. This isn't new to us. It may be new to the world. Yet we know that the world not only now knows about it, but allows it to happen. This is a never again moment that we live through today. And then later on, we'll talk back, and maybe Obama will come out, the president who I supported, and say, yeah, this was a mistake, and maybe, you know, this is Rwanda, Bosnia, what have you. And we live through it today. And it's everybody's responsibility as a human being to do something to stop it.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm just going to start by sharing just a quick brief story. A couple of weeks ago, I was in an IDP camp in northern Iraq, and I was sitting with a Yazidi woman, and she was sharing with me her experiences of the mass atrocities that were perpetrated against her. And suddenly she stopped talking, and she looked at the TV, because that was the one kind of belonging that she had in the tent. And she stopped, and she looked at me, and she said, "I will never get the image of that boy out of my mind." And what she was referring to was the 3-year-old Syrian boy who was found on the shores and had died when his family sought refuge after having been turned away. And I was so struck by the fact that here was a woman who had experienced such devastation herself, yet for that particular moment she was united just based on the sheer kind of common experience and the denial of dignity that both she and the Syrian people have experienced. And she turned to me and she said, how can we as a world allow this to happen? And when we talk about the value of the photos, the reason why the museum brought the photos to Washington, D.C. with the help of Mouaz and others is because that expression of outrage, that expression of compassion that that woman exhibited despite everything she's already endured herself is what we hope to be able to galvanize and mobilize amongst the broader American public and the international community, amongst those of us who live every day free from persecution and from attack. We want to do that because one of the reasons why we are here today is that it's not that we lack the institutions that can deal with the crisis in Syria. It's not that we need new judicial instruments or mechanisms for political negotiation. What we lack is the political resolve to act. And what we wanted to do is to be able to show that the people who are being killed in Syria today, the people that are being tortured, that are having their lives utterly destroyed, generations, to be quite frank, are having their lives destroyed, are women, children, elderly, and yes, young men. And I say that because in my previous life, I did 7 years of Security Council advocacy, of which a number of those years, unfortunately, were on Syria. And increasingly, I was amazed by how narratives around counterterrorism, how discussions about the fact that these were simply young men who were out protesting, intent to overthrow a government, were pervading through the thoughts of ambassadors on the Security Council and others, especially in the early days of the protests, despite evidence that we had. And increasingly, I would be told, well, don't you have any, concrete, can you show me images? Can you provide concrete documentation? I know it's incredibly hard. I mean, usually perpetrators of mass atrocities don't want people to know the scale and the enormity of the atrocity crimes that they're committing. And in the absence of those images, those ambassadors and others could continue with their narrative that, for the most part, supported what the Assad regime was saying, because we lacked what we have today. And it saddens me immensely that we didn't have this type of evidence to be able to show in 2011, because there were things that could have been done and should have been done much earlier. And I need to say that the political resolve to act is not merely something that was failing on the part of the Russians or the Chinese or the South Africans or the Indians. It was across the board. There were certain countries and certain individuals that were very much inclined to act and wanted to take, and when I say act, a whole host of spectrum. I mean, we did little things like advocate for language that condemned the attacks of Assad and got pushback on that. When I think about it, I think it was 2013 when we did the resolution around the ICC. I had difficulty convincing my own government as a Canadian that they should support and endorse the resolution, which we did not do in the end. So when we talk about what's happened in Syria, we have to think about it as kind of an abdication of the responsibility to protect. And the desire of the museum in trying to bring these photos today to the attention of the international community is to try to remind people that there is still things that we can and should do to provide protection. Our hope is to be able to shed light on the atrocities that are being perpetrated and do something that was not done for Jews and others during the Second World War. And maybe just to kind of wrap up in the interest of having some time for discussion, I recently came back from the border of Turkey and Syria with the help of Mouaz and his colleagues, met with a number of people, and it wasn't my first time there. And you have this moment where you walk into a store and you see a young Syrian woman who you've seen before because she's been working in that store since she had to flee her home in Aleppo. And you know that there's nothing you can say because I don't know when she's going to go home or if she can go home. And in that particular moment, you have to ask people, what is it that they want? And across the board, from it being family members who have experienced these atrocity crimes and are involved in some of the potential future prosecutions that Ambassador Rapp mentioned, to the woman in that store, they say they want justice and they want accountability. And they say that the culture of impunity that existed in Syria before these crimes occurred contributed to the situation that we're in today. So in the absence of accountability for these crimes, we're only going to potentially see future cycles of violence in the future. I'd also say that the second thing that everyone asks for is for protection, physical protection. We find ourselves now in a situation where, because we've waited so long to sincerely act, the options that are available, the measures and tools that are available are far narrower, and the political cost and the economic cost of them are far greater. It's much harder to mobilize political action to support something like a no-fly zone than a whole host of measures that could have been implemented at an earlier stage. And I think it's important then just to kind of end on highlighting that the commitment to never again was not meant to be simply rhetoric. And expending the language of never again as rhetoric without a commitment to uphold it is dangerous. It imperils lives. It sets expectations for action that will not be met. And it also leads to a situation where governments are going to be held responsible in the future for failing to act. So I think on that, I'm going to end just because taking advantage of talking to law students, and I was thinking about what I would have liked to have maybe been told 10 years ago. There is a lot that you can do, and there's a lot that you can do in an individual capacity. There's a lot that your law school can do in terms of supporting the efforts that are being undertaken today through your legal clinic and others to draw attention. Harvard's Law School clinic did an amazing report, for example, on Burma and crimes against humanity. Did advocacy on Burma for many years. It was an invaluable tool to be able to turn to, and that's a great resource. The second thing I would just say is that each of you at some point in the future may potentially have an opportunity to work for your own government, work for other multilateral institutions. And I think it's really critical that we truly embed some of the values that has been mentioned by the other panelists and by Tyler about the importance of accountability and impunity, and also just recognize that we can't use human rights as a bartering tool when we are dealing with a whole host of interests. The commitment to the responsibility to protect, the statement that the US government has said that atrocity prevention is a core national security interest, necessitates that human rights are given equal consideration in identifying what the strategies are to responding to Assad, ISIS, or any other threat that exists in the world today. So with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm cognizant of time as well, but there is at least one question that I really did want to ask before turning it over to others, and it actually has to do with Cesar himself, because many people on this panel have a very sort of unique interaction with someone who is a shrouded figure for security reasons. So Mouaz, you described a little bit sort of what motivated him, how in many ways it was extraordinarily heroic of him to stay in the country and to continue taking these photos and then to smuggle them out. And from what you were describing, it sounded like his interest was sort of in documentation and in truth, so that the families themselves could know what had happened to their loved ones. And I was just hoping that you or others who have spoken to him might be able to say a little bit more about what he hoped would happen when the photos were sort of made public. How does he feel now? You know, is he disappointed? Is he satisfied? You know, sort of as the author of this cache of photos, what would he like to see happen next?
You know, Ambassador Rapp, by the way, knows him probably just as well and has, has spent a lot of time. By the way, I can't stress how proud to be American I am to know that an ambassador working with the government had gone at such great lengths to help in this cause. I mean, I have so many anecdotes, and I'm sure he can share with you too, just on the troubles that he has just to be able to go and meet with Cesar, and meet with others, and do this regularly and support this cause. I want to tell you that, when Cesar came to the United States, his main motivation was to let families know. He had seen some of his own neighbors in these pictures, couldn't tell them about it, so understood sort of how that felt, and I think that was one of the bigger motivations for him to do so. But he did come and speak in front of Congress and speak to Samantha Power and went to the White House, and really did believe at that point that the United States was going to do something. Right, and he understood that that the U.S. is the only country capable of doing something, and it would. He didn't have prescriptions, like he didn't know. He wrote a letter to the president, and he said in the letter, that justice and accountability are incredibly important. But he wrote that it's important to prevent the 300,000 more people sitting in Assad jails right now from facing the same fate. I don't know many Syrians that don't have someone in one of these intelligence branches or jails, and that trying to save their lives, because he wrote, we can't get their lives back, but try to help the ones that are still there, save their lives from seeing the same fate. We never got a response for a while, and he went back to Europe saying, I was going to check the last Viber messages with him, but essentially, he feels deserted, which is interesting. It's exactly how every Syrian feels. If you talk to them about, the biggest killer is barrel bombs, believe it or not to, mention that what's going on in jail. So he feels that way. He feels extremely disappointed, again, based on those conversations of what came out. Look, Mouaz, I did all this stuff. What came out? Nothing. Well, and in order to try to get some sort of response, I called Michael Gordon, the New York Times, and asked him to find out what happened with the letter, because I figured he would be more motivating for them to respond than Cesar or anybody else. And so Michael did call, And then I get a call the next day from the White House saying, hey, man, do you have another copy of that letter? So I said, no, absolutely. I had, like, of course I had copies of the letter. But no, I don't have any copies of the letter. And yeah, figure it out. So they dug around for a while. I found it in some drawer or wherever it is that they had put it. And then we got a letter written by Ben Rhodes that said, you know, we're going to continue to push for monitors to get into those jails. On a good day, when we have like a 6-month, I don't know, warning for the regime, to have monitors in Assad jails would be just, you would see a catastrophe that's unfolding and the misery that's there. So of course, Cesar got the letter and saw that response. And I'm not gonna, you know, I'd let you imagine what he thought of that.
Do others want to weigh in on this?
Ambassador.
Well, I could weigh in. I mean, I saw him in his country of refuge not too long ago, and I would say, you know, that he's still hopeful that things will be done, and he was still willing to work with us. Though on the other hand, it is an isolating experience being out of your country, and particularly for him because of the situation of his security. And he mentioned to me someone in a neighboring country, not too far away, but across the water, that had been an imam that had been killed, et cetera. It was a moderate, and really was worried. And to be frank, I think I see this having dealt with lots of witnesses, and those sometimes that are implicated in the crime, and I don't really see him as implicated in this crime at all. But particularly when they come forth, and then this becomes the thing that it is, which is big, but maybe not big enough. They begin to worry about what this has meant to their family, what it means to extended members, and whereas members of his family and some of the extended family have gotten out, there are others that haven't. And so it's kind of like if I put them at risk for nothing. And that, I think, weighs the hardest on him, and would weigh on me and on anyone else. And it's certainly why I've said myself, having left the position as ambassador at large in August, that I'll keep working on this for the rest of my life as a volunteer. I mean, this kind of courage needs to be vindicated, and it's important for all of us to do what we can.
So I think I have literally a dozen other questions that I wanted to ask, but I'm sure you all do as well. So if folks have questions, why don't we just take a couple, and then we can let the panel respond. Sure. So why don't we start here and then back?
Thank you guys so much for coming. I used to work a bit with the Syrian campaign, so my question is, I'm thinking these photos are so important, but thinking about from sort of a broader advocacy perspective, they tell a very specific story about Syria. And I'm wondering about the reactions that you get from decision makers when you use these photos to tell the story of Syria versus, for example, the story of the way homeless or the story of refugees. What works for different advocacy goals that you have?
Why don't we take a couple and then?
Okay, so no doubt the Syrian government is guilty of many human rights violations and war crimes, as well as the rebels, the Free Syrian Army, as well as ISIS. But other governments in the region also have been guilty of the same types of human rights violations. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel are all well known to practice torture. The United States itself practiced torture during the Bush years. The United States just bombed a hospital in Afghanistan. So it's fine to prosecute war criminals from governments that are considered to be our official enemies, but shouldn't we also have accountability for human rights violations of those of our allies and our own government officials as well?
I want to answer that guy.
Any other questions that people want to add for this first round? Yeah.
So slightly different note. I've worked about Lebanon, and obviously they've dealt with civil war there. They've dealt with it in some ways. They're still living with the fact that people in power have committed war crimes. They know it. They've been in jail. They've come out of jail. Yet the country still exists. You said that there can't be peace with justice. I'd say that there's perhaps an example of a difficult peace, but nevertheless a peace without justice next door.
And we'll take one more. Yeah, do you want to weigh in as well?
And I would like to emphasize on what you guys first. Thank you very much for coming. And you mentioned that there can be son is the cause of many, many other crimes than the ones we see in these pictures, and not only in Syria. Of course, you know how much difficulties people suffer from the atrocities of this regime, and how any possibility of accountability is the real threat of this regime. And one of the main proofs is the regime's reaction to the establishment of a special tribunal for Lebanon. Well, this is the first tribunal that actually created a possibility of holding this regime accountable, and the regime went crazy. And they were ready to throw a war in Lebanon, and they killed many Lebanese officers who were involved in this tribunal just because of the threat of being held accountable one day. So no peace without justice is not a cliche. It's the only right thing that can be said in such situation.
So just to respond to the image question, by far the most important image thus far to move policy has been the image of Aylan Kurdi on the beach. There's something about that image, obviously it's a baby dressed in clothes, that people can see their own, Westerners can see their own children wearing. The story behind that image and behind his family is one that sort of tells a lot of the tale of the war. I mean, his family initially fled, or some members of his family were detained and tortured by Assad. They fled the areas that they were living, I think closer to Damascus, into areas that were then threatened by ISIS, and then they finally left the country. So that image, I mean, has been the only one to galvanize the international imagination for any extended period of time. There's something about the Caesar photos. First of all, just overwhelming. You have 55,000 or about photos of the most horrible barbarity. You can't even show it in a lot of the media outlets. Often, I mean, the ones you're seeing here, some of them are blurred out. And there's something overwhelming about it that unless you have policymakers that are really in the weeds on it or really committed, like for instance, Senator John McCain, he has a stack of these photos on his desk in his office, and there's other congresspeople and policymakers. Dick Durbin, for instance, has the same. And they're constantly reminded of these images. But there's something about the way that these photos affect people that they want to look away. And that's why that this panel is so aptly named Don't Look Away, because of the importance of this gruesome crime that's being committed today. But in terms of like getting people to change their minds, it's images of, you never know what the image is going to be. But I mean, thus far it's the Aylan Kurdi image.
Naomi, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because I think that there's a lot there in that question. I think Syria and working on Syria has confronted the human rights community and the advocacy community with challenges that I think we hadn't kind of grappled with to this degree before, in part because the targets that were kind of identified to influence were such a wide array and included governments that we haven't traditionally been effective in influencing, including the Russias, the Chinas, the emerging powers that were all, if you remember at the early days of the conflict, you had the entire BRICS group on the Security Council. And because of the timing that, again, we had an election here in the United States, a number of different factors. But, having worked on a number of these different crises, we often feel that we need images because we think there's a correlation between the images and action. And I think what this unfortunately sometimes shows is that's not necessarily the case. And you can have action where there is political will in the absence of any real kind of even information or even accurate documentation at times. So it does pose a lot of questions. I think where the images become really critical is it provides an opportunity for us to say, you can't say you did not know. And that's a powerful tool in the moment. It's also a very powerful tool in the decades to come. And in terms of actually kind of acknowledging and documenting what has happened, I think that's a really important tool. I just want to say one thing on the accountability aspect, in part because we are here at the law school, but I don't think we should confuse relative calm in countries or in particular places with peace, and that you can't, I think some of us are open to the idea that you can have different forms and iterations of what justice looks like, but it can't be sidelined in any discussion and negotiation of what will happen in the future in a particular country. And I only say that because if you had South Africans here in the room, they would talk about the truth and reconciliation process. If you had Latin Americans, they would talk about the various commissions that have helped their countries come over an impasse. It is rare, I can't think of a country that I've worked in or worked on where in the absence of any form of accountability, any iteration of it, you actually see what we call as peace. Relative calm is something very different than peace from which a flourishing society can emerge.
And I want to quickly agree with what you said. And the crimes that the regime has done, his father and now him in Lebanon, are despicable. And I agree with your comment and sentiment. And to answer your question, two things. First of all, anyone who's done war crimes, an ally, a friend, not a friend of the United States, should, that's my personal belief, should be prosecuted. Everybody should be held accountable, no matter who it is. So no one's saying that one over another, dictator, friend dictator, or enemy dictator, anybody in the region, so on. And when you mentioned the crimes already being committed on the ground, I also, the same sentiment goes, anyone who does crime on the ground, regardless of their political points of view, should be prosecuted. But you said, oh, the rebels and ISIS. I want to make clear, and I'm sure maybe you misspoke, but if anyone does even any slight research into anything that's, that doesn't have a clear agenda, or like an Assad regime outlet, you would understand that the rebels and ISIS are the biggest enemies on the ground in Syria. There are three parties to this crisis. A third party grew out of the fact that nobody cared for what's going on there. And ISIS, since its inception, has fought the rebels and every front, and so their crimes are horrendous. And I think they would love to reach this level of evil if they had the machinery and institutions to do it, but they still are sure working hard to reach the level of atrocities that Assad has committed. And in every instance, the Syrian people are stuck between a war against ISIS and a war against the Assad regime, because not that ISIS and Assad regime are working together, but the fact is there's a mutual interest. And the mutual interest is that the biggest threat to the Assad regime is a civilian, democratic opposition, and the biggest threat to ISIS are moderate Muslims, the indigenous people of the land, and so on, that are fighting against them. And for those two, they understand that this is their biggest threat, and they're happy to get rid of that biggest threat. So at the end of the day, ISIS can say, look, you got to get rid of the Assad regime, no one fights against it. And Assad can say, look, it's either me or ISIS, and that's not the case. I have an organization that works on the ground. We have 4 offices inside of Syria. I'm back and forth every couple of months. 2 of our young men, 23 and 24, were taken by the Assad regime and tortured to death in Homs. 2 others, a 24 and a 29-year-old, were taken by ISIL and beheaded. Sunni Muslims, I hate speaking in sectarian terms, and that's really just a microcosm. That's just a small example of what the Syrian people are facing across the board. So I just want to make sure that difference is clear. But I agree with you, anyone that does a crime should be prosecuted, no matter who it is.
Well, let me jump in on that question in particular, because I clearly agree, and I'm a prosecutor in the United States and then at the international level for a total of like 17 years, and we should prosecute everybody. And no country is perfect. Our own country does have a system of military justice. We convict the Blackwater guards who shoot people in Cesars Square, and they go to prison for 30 to 30 years to life. We convict Sergeant Bales for killing Afghanistan civilians, going out and killing 16 on a morning. Not enough is done in these areas, but if you look at a situation like Syria, nobody is prosecuted for torturing people to death. Nobody is for committing intentional acts against tens of thousands of human beings. And I think one has to look at the degree of these cases. And as someone who's prosecuted it, I sometimes hear the political argument, basically, well, if you can't prosecute everything, you can't even prosecute the worst killer in the world. I mean, that's like saying we shouldn't have prosecuted Nuremberg and the Nazis for the Holocaust because we couldn't prosecute Stalin. No, you prosecute who you can. You establish the standards. You work as hard as you can to bring the law to places where it isn't. And even raising the issue about double standards, et cetera, is not, politically it's difficult, but it forces us and others to look at our own situation, understand that, primarily it's the country where these whose citizens are committing these crimes that should be prosecuting them, and often are doing it. And it's only when they won't do it, and in fact they're complicit in it, that you want to take it to the international level. And that's obviously we've got in the Syria situation. Finally, on the peace without justice issue, I hate to go over to Iraq because obviously that carries a whole other history. But we had the challenge when ISIL began to move in Iraq and took over Anbar province and part of Nineveh province, and recognized that in Iraq there was a problem with the Maliki government. Fortunately, there was a vote and a possibility for a new government to be formed with a Shia leader, but someone who would work with the Sunni community. The Sunni community is a minority in Iraq, obviously under Saddam Hussein. It may have had a more privileged position. But we knew that there was no way that you could keep Iraq together unless you had a government that looked out for all of the three basic groups in Iraq. With Assad, you've got somebody 1,000 times worse than Maliki. I do not know a Sunni person that I've run into that would sit in the room with him in a government. And there are those who would say, oh, well, we should have a peace, he should be in power for a period of time. How does that work? How does it work that you enable somebody that's murdered your mother, father, sister, and brother, and you basically allow them to remain in power? How we get to peace is going to be very, very challenging. I mean, there are efforts of dialogue between the Sunni and Alawite community. I think there can be a future in Syria. But it can't be a future on the back of this kind of murder. You cannot basically do these kinds of things to the majority of the people in your country and think that you can go forward. And finally, on the question of, because we hear the argument certainly from Assad himself and from the Russians that he's a bulwark against ISIL and against the terrorist extremists. I was on a platform in Geneva about 3 weeks ago with a defecting Syrian general, and he said, we've dropped more than 2,000 barrel bombs on the opposition, and neighborhoods where ISIL wasn't. To date, we've dropped 1 barrel bomb on ISIL. This guy's not fighting, and indeed the Russians, as they come in, they're not fighting ISIL either. They're fighting a cynical campaign to keep this person in power. So fundamentally, we have to have justice here, and a justice that reflects the interest of all of the Syrian community if we're going to have peace. And any other way won't get us peace. It'll just enable further crimes in the future.
I just want to make one quick comment, I think, to your point a little bit. I mean, I speak here not in my capacity as the Syrian Emergency Task Force, the Coalition for Democratic Syria, and so on, but on behalf of the Caesar team, and this is a stance that they have taken. We don't view this, we don't want this to be, this whole file that we have, an obstacle to a political solution. As a matter of fact, we see this as part of the solution. So, we're not even, Caesar himself and the team around him and everyone that's been involved in this, and it's been a huge undertaking, by the way, zero funding, zero support, just amazing volunteers, is we want this to be a way to get to the right direction while ensuring absolutely justice and accountability. So I just want to sort of also just make that note.
Thank you. So let me again thank our panelists for all of the ideas and information that you've shared with us today. A reminder that the exhibit will run for the next 2 weeks in Lewis 202, and hopefully this is just the start of conversations about these issues at the law school and more broadly. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.